Okay, the Thursday, August 1st, 2019, Water Quality Management Committee meeting will come to order. We apologize in advance for the lack of parking. We have nothing to do with that. And we apologize in advance for the relatively small turnout here. One of us is out with a health issue. Let's see, who else is out? Ron Zweig has told us he won't be able to attend. The others are all here. One of us is going to leave at 3 and come back, and one of us is going to leave at 4:15 when the other one has come back. So there will be a quorum. And frankly, today you don't want to hear from us. You want to hear from the committee's consultant, who has been working with the working group of this committee, which is John and Steve and myself, looking at the Oyster Pond situation in terms of nitrogen reduction and the alternatives to removing it. The report is going to be shown as part of a PowerPoint, and Ed Leonard from Wright Pierce, who is our consultant on this, is going to run through that and then take comments and questions from the committee and from anyone else who has comments and questions. So with that, Ed?
Yeah. All right, thanks for having me here today. I'm Ed Leonard. I'm the project manager with Wright Pierce on the project. I've seen quite a number of your faces over the years in the multiple meetings that we've had on the project. This is the report. The current version of the report is dated July 2019. It's available, posted on the WQMC website, I believe. Not yet? Okay.
Where is it posted at this point?
You just emailed it to me this morning. I have no idea.
What are you waiting for?
Yeah,
Okay. Well,
you're supposed to
Does it-
anticipate.
it does exist as a PDF.
All right,
But we do intend to post.
It will be.
it will be posted
available.
right after this meeting.
Kristen, how do I get this full screen?
Sorry.
All right.
Thank you. All right. So the purpose of this plan is to address the Mass Estuaries Project, TMDL, for Oyster Pond. There was a technical report issued by MEP in 2006 and a TMDL issued in 2008. Those required nitrogen removal in order to reestablish good water quality and good health in Oyster Pond. So the purpose of this project was to identify water quality needs in order to address that, to identify options, solutions, and to develop costs and timelines for moving forward with the recommendations. So we've been at this for a while. We had kickoff meetings as early as 2013 with the town staff as well as OPET at their clubhouse. We developed a needs assessment report in 2013. We met with the Water Quality Management Committee. We developed an alternatives analysis report. We met with the Water Quality Management Committee. We've had a couple of neighborhood meetings, the most recent of which was last summer, about a year ago. And since that time, we've been working on the implementation plan, which is mostly the material I'm going to present today. So just by way of quick background, Oyster Pond is about 63 acres. It's generally about 3 to 4 meters deep, but there's 2 deep holes in it, which play a factor in the water quality. There's a deep hole in the northern basin, which is about 4.5 meters deep, and there's a deep hole as you get closer to Surf Drive, which is close to 7 meters deep. And because of the depth, they tend to isolate based on temperature and salinity, and that tends to cause some of the water quality problems. Going back in time, this was open to the ocean. Longshore Currents eventually closed it off. There was a railroad line installed that was put in. Oysters haven't lived in this pond for 100 years. There was a culvert installed which changed the water quality. There was a weir installed to manage that salinity, and that was based on work with Woods Hole, I believe, MEP, OPET, and that was back in the late 90s. So this is a sort of man-made, sort of natural situation that has some water quality implications. Now, from the Mass Estuaries Project, they've identified that 72% of the nitrogen load to Oyster Pond is related to wastewater. 15% is related to atmospheric deposition. So just over 10% is related to other land use, like fertilizer, stormwater, and other, rainfall impervious surfaces. So the removal requirements are close to 70% nitrogen removal. So that's a pretty big number. It's a big lift in order to remove the nitrogen that MEP has identified, which means there'll be a lot of impacts to homeowners in the watershed. So there's about 225 dwelling units. We use dwelling units because treetops is one parcel, but a lot of dwelling units. So rather than using parcels, we use dwelling units all the way through the document. There's only a little bit of growth planned in this watershed, in part because it's largely developed, in part because OPET bought several parcels of land in the past couple of years and put that to conservation. So there's only about eight dwelling units that we've projected for future growth, which is good from a water quality perspective. The total nitrogen concentration in the water in the pond is relatively high, although it has been decreasing in the past five or so years since we've been looking at the data. But it's also really variable, and the variability comes from those deep holes I talked about, overwash coming in storms, strong winds cause the pond to mix, and those result in some of the intermittent issues that you see in the water with algae blooms, turbidity, things like that. We talked about stratification. The other big thing is the trunk river. As it flows out of the pond through the lagoon, the trunk river is actually the hydraulic restriction that control the weir and the river are the things that control the water flow out of the pond. And that needs to be maintained in order to keep the pond flowing correctly, flushing itself so that it doesn't accumulate nutrients in it. So that's an important part of the plan. We did two alternatives analyses. Well, we did an alternatives analysis. We updated it, so we've done it twice. As a part of that, we looked at numerous non-traditional methods and eliminated them fairly early in the process. I'm not going to get into the details of that. We did develop 6 composite plans to try and give a broad array of options to address the nutrients. One of them was to completely to sewer and send it all to Blacksmith Shop Road treatment plant. That was option 1. Option 6 was to do nothing. And the other options in between were to build small treatment plants in the watershed, outside the watershed, or to work with individual homeowners to upgrade their septic systems with nitrogen removing systems. Looking at the numbers, looking at some of the feedback that we got from neighborhood meetings, the 2 plans that we shortlisted were Plan 1, send it to Blacksmith Shop Road, and Plan 5, which was a fairly high-level nitrogen removing on-site system for each home in the watershed. One thing that's important to note is this Plan 5, 10 milligrams per liter, is fairly high-end treatment for an on-site system. And that's something that the working group has been working closely with George Heufelder and his group at MassTech, been working with DEP in order to come up with a program to monitor those and to work them from a non-approved status to a approved status. And those things are going to take some time to work through the approval process. But those are the 2 plans, Plan 1, Plan 5. So since we met in 2018, the working group and Wright Pierce have been working on a handful of things. One was to make an assessment of how much capacity is left at the Blacksmith Shop Road treatment plant. And the conclusion of that is there's none, and that this committee has been working diligently to try and find more capacity in town. The town needs it for other watersheds in town, and this is one that needs to be added to that list. We've been monitoring the data that comes out of the West Falmouth Harbor pilot project, and some of those systems can produce TN levels that are less than 10, and some can't. So that's an evolution that we will continue to monitor. And then to work through, like I mentioned, a framework to do this cost effectively with on-site systems with DEP. And the working group has been back and forth with DEP 5, 6, 7 times, numerous meetings. I think they're warming up to the idea. They still have, I think, more comments. They don't put their pen down when they're reviewing things. But we tried to come up with a framework that was reasonable, that was managed by the town, so that we could demonstrate to DEP that this is a good approach to take. So based on those actions, the working group selected Plan 5 as the basis for the plan, which is a quote-unquote non-traditional plan. DEP considers sewers traditional, and everything else falls in the non-traditional bucket. So we have a traditional plan, a non-traditional plan with a traditional backup. And I'll get to why we have that in a second. We did develop this whole plan in concert with the Cape Cod Commission's 208 Water Quality Plan update, so we would fully expect to get the Commission's consistency determination, which is an important check in the box in order to get funding from the state. So when you have a non-traditional plan or a hybrid plan, which is a combination of sewers and something else, DEP requires a watershed permit. That's a fairly new concept in Massachusetts. DEP's issued one to the Pleasant Bay Alliance. So we set up our implementation plan to meet the requirements of that watershed permit. It requires that the town take the lead in the effort, a responsible management entity. Requires you to identify an implementation schedule, whether it's all at once or phased. You need to establish a monitoring program to keep track of what you've done and what the benefits or what the improvements to the water have been. To have that traditional backup plan, so that's why we have it outlined or developed in here, and then have a financial plan, just like any other CWMP. You have to know how you're going to pay for it and when. So the responsible management entity, as it's been outlined, is going to be the town. So the town is going to be responsible for reviewing, just like a septic system now, the town reviews that. The town would review the design that a homeowner would put together to put in this extra treatment step, make sure that it meets the town's regulations, issue a permit for the homeowner to move forward. The town will exercise some procurement control on this to help bring down the unit cost for homeowners, to basically buy them more in bulk, so there's a better unit cost. The town would be responsible for monitoring operations and maintenance of the systems, which will require an easement from homeowners to allow them on the property in order to do that work. The RME will take care of septic pumping for those systems, and also take care of the record keeping and reporting that DEP is going to require in order to demonstrate progress towards the TMDL. So there's a whole bunch of material in here about how the town will move forward with a non-traditional plan. Before I do this, one of the reasons why the non-traditional plan, several of the reasons are, these sites are quite distant from the sewer, and I'll show you how far in a minute. The lots in this watershed are fairly large, generally speaking. The town really does, the town has a significant nitrogen wastewater problem townwide, and the town really needs a non-sewer option in many other places in the town. And so this was a good fit watershed to push this issue with DEP and to get approval for this kind of approach. So this is the right watershed to take this approach, and it's an important part of the town's toolbox. So what does it mean? We have 168 what we call advanced IA systems, so total nitrogen less than 10. We're outlined it in 2 phases, and I'll get into that in a second. We're also counting on, in that pie, we're counting on other things to help take care of some of this nitrogen. Fertilizer regulations that the town put in place a while ago will take some of that reduction. The town has a stormwater permit that requires best management practices of stormwater, and that will help. And we also know from long-term data monitoring from Boston University as well as EPA that atmospheric sources of nitrogen are decreasing. And where it's a significant portion of the load to Oyster Pond, it's something we need to keep track of and take advantage of, because we're all paying for the Clean Air Act modifications. Or improvement, we're paying for the Clean Air Act, so we might as well monitor it and take credit for it. We have nitrogen that comes from the sediment, and because we've met the nitrogen removal requirements going into the pond, we've taken the credit that the Mass Estuaries Project says we can from the sediment. And then we're gonna make sure that we inspect and maintain, inspect and do the maintenance dredging of the trunk river. So in terms of the phasing, everything that's in green is phase one. And the reason phase one was selected is twofold. One, it's the closest parcels to the water. They're all within what MEP identifies as the 10-year travel time of a drop of water, 10 years to get to the pond, or they're south of Woods Hole Road. So it's an and. The remainder of the parcels, phase two, will happen 20 plus years later, and I'll get to the schedule in a second. You'll note that Woods Hole Oceanographic has some dorms. They put in an IA system in 2016, and that actually is in the Oyster Pond watershed. So we included that in the math. It is an extra load that was added subsequent to the MEP, but it's also got an IA system. And yes, I did confirm it. Yeah, I confirmed it. Okay, so green is phase one, orange is phase two. So from a timeline perspective, we have a number of years before the town's gonna move forward with a request for appropriations for this CWMP as well as the other one that the town's actively working on right now for the South Coastal Watersheds. So that's 2024. So between now and 2024, there's a bunch of things that need to happen. We need to get approvals from MEPA, DEP, Cape Cod Commission. We need to obtain a watershed permit that I described before. There's permits being secured right now to do the maintenance dredging for the trunk river, so do that. We need to implement the RME concept, put it like, it's written down and it's in here in Appendix F, but to then say, okay, it's gonna be this department that does it, and then to start outlining the procedures for who does that, so implement that. Initiate what I called phase zero activities, which I'll talk about later. And then as we get closer to 2024, based on those phase zero activities, basically as I understand it, put it to the voters to say, are we gonna do this plan, or are we just gonna do sewers? But the plan is the advanced IA plan. So then we would do the advanced IA plan, which means that homeowners would, the town would issue a start date, say it's January 1, 2025. Within a year, you'd need to submit your design using the systems that the town procured at a good unit cost. Get a permit and install it within 3 years of that date. When phase one does that, we'll have removed 80% of the wastewater load, of the wastewater nitrogen load to the pond. And then we're gonna continue monitoring for 10 years. Because we need to make sure that we need to make sure before we do more, that one, maybe we already met the TMDL, or do we need to do more? So we wanna make sure that there's time for that remediated water, that cleaner water to get to the pond and have an impact, a beneficial impact to the pond.
When you say monitoring, do you mean the system, monitoring the system simultaneously with monitoring the pond? Or just
Correct,
monitoring the
yes, both. I'll talk a little bit more about the environmental monitoring, but yes, each of the systems, the RME is gonna need to, the town, the RME is gonna need to, has come up with an approach to monitor the aggregate effectiveness of the systems without having to go to every single home and collect samples every single quarter. So we came up with a statistical approach to save cost, basically, to bring down the cost of an IA, advanced IA approach. So coupled with that, we need to also monitor the water column concentrations. We need to look at the sediment. We need to monitor the stormwater. We need to look at the benthic habitat of the bugs and stuff that live in the mud happy, because that's one of the criteria of meeting a TMDL, is have you reestablished the habitat. So come 2039, a whole new set of people will look at all the data and say, what do we do now? Do we do phase 2, or do we have to do something else? And then finish the job. So we talked about most of this here. So the environmental program, water column, benthic habitat, system performance. Keep an eye on that atmospheric nitrogen sources. They've been going down. We expect them to continue to go down. There may be a point in the future where maybe that trend reverses. And who knows what that'll be, but we need to keep an eye on it. We've been saying that to the county and the state for years, that it's an important thing. And then we also need to monitor changes in technology. Make sure that if there's some new way that costs less to treat nitrogen on site, that we take advantage of that. The traditional backup plan is basically phase 1. It's the same parcels. So it's within the 10-year travel time south of Woods Hole Road. And we would do that with low-pressure sewer systems, so each house would get a small pump station specifically designed for that, that size, a small, 4 or 5 bedroom home. You pump through force mains about 6,000 feet to right over there, Shivricks Pond lift station, which is right behind the post office. So that's 6,000 feet's a pretty good distance away from your watershed. And then we'd have all the other components that were the baseline, what we call baseline components, the fertilizer, stormwater, that's part of that. So from a financing perspective, we put together cost estimates for phase 1. We did it for both, the advanced IA approach and the traditional plan. We took great pains to come up with a consistent methodology with the South Coastal CWMP so that the town had sets of numbers that weren't truly apples and oranges. They were hopefully just different types of apples. We worked pretty hard to get them close. All the costs in here are expressed in 2026 dollars because we're not expecting to actually spend that money until then. We had to look at in order to get to what does it cost a homeowner, we had to look at how it would be financed, different loans. There's some enhanced loans with DEP that are 0% interest. There's general municipal bonds, which tend to be in the 4% range. The county has a loan program as well, and we aren't expecting any grants for this watershed. We had to work out a cost allocation methodology, which I'll probably just let that be a Q&A thing. But there are slightly different cost allocation strategies for the 2 plans. What it amounts to is we have 189 current dwelling units that are impacted by the plan. And the capital costs are pretty dramatically different, as are the O&M costs. So the capital cost of the advanced IA plan is $9.1 million, whereas the traditional backup plan is over $14 million. From an annual O&M perspective, there's a lot that goes into monitoring the advanced IA systems and running them. So we have 168 little treatment plants in a watershed. When you take the present worth of all that annual O&M and bring it and add it to the capital cost, they're actually pretty close. They're similar. So you've saved money up front, you spend more over the years, but ultimately you have two options that are reasonably close to each other from a present worth perspective. And then if you look at what does that amount to per dwelling unit, they're also fairly close. But it's still not, it's a fair amount of money.
$100,000 per house. Spread out over 20 years.
For, well, yeah, the end, yeah, $5,000 a year.
That's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money. But in terms of the options, they're fairly equivalent to each other, but it's a lot of money. And remember, going back to the beginning, there's 70% removal, nitrogen removal in the watershed, which means that it's got a fairly substantial footprint in terms of homes, parcels, dwelling units that are impacted.
What is the estimated longevity of each
Mhm.
plant? How often are we going to have to replace these?
Sure. Advanced IA systems are, it has a couple components. There's the septic tank, which lasts generally quite a long time, 30, 40, 50 years. So a regular Title V system, the septic tank lasts a long time. The leach field might last 10 to maybe 25 years, depending on how heavily you use it, how, if you're seasonal, if there's good soils underneath it. There's a whole bunch of factors that go into how long a leach field lasts. The thing that we're adding is in between those two pieces. The treatment stuff happens in between. That stuff's mechanical equipment, and that typically lasts 15 to 25 years, depending on the piece.
So by the time we finish, by the time phase 2 comes around, won't phase 1 have to be revamped, or just about?
Well, parts of it could be, yeah.
So there'll be increase.
Just like a septic system. I mean, if you look at a septic system, people don't generally take several $100s a year and put it in your septic tank jar of money. But really, if you have to replace a whole system on a 20-year interval, it's what, $20,000, $30,000, depending on whether you're lucky or not. And if you divide that by 20 years, that's a lot of money too. So the no action cost is not zero. It's still costly, but you have a good point. So next steps, we need to move this plan, or get input, update the report, move forward through this committee, through the select board, align the schedule with the South Coastal CWMP, and get that submitted for approvals through the state and the county. The phase 0 task that I mentioned before, the whole proof of concept, how is the RME gonna work? How palatable is it? Is it really just too much work for the town to take on, or does it feel right? Does it feel like a viable thing that's also scalable to these other watersheds that the town might need to do this with? Do some work to try and, to get that additional effluent disposal capacity, which is part of the South Coastal CWMP, but to make sure that that request is big enough to accommodate this extra capacity. There's some easements to get for this, so the access easements for the advanced IA plan for the town to do some of these things that would normally be on the homeowner. The traditional backup plan will also have easements in order to connect some pipes across some private properties. Refine the financial plan and prep for that 2024 town meeting along with the other CWMP. There has been some environmental monitoring that's been done. OPET does stuff pretty much every year. The town does monitoring as well through MEP and pond watchers. Keep doing that. That's important data to have. And then continue dredging as needed. So that's the thumbnail of the implementation plan. Take whatever questions anybody has.
So before we go to the audience, why don't we, are there questions from the committee? Matt? So does your traditional backup plan costs account for the potential costs you'd need to find that new disposal or discharge capacity? Is that rolled into that?
We included an allocation for it. I mean, for this site, we're only looking for, I want to say it was 25, 30,000 gallons a day, which is a fairly small number when you compare it to the South Coastal. So the marginal cost is low, but we did include some.
Any other questions? Steve?
I have a couple comments. I think the most important one is that everybody should realize that the present worth costs can be adjusted quite widely depending on the lifetimes of things that you just brought up and the interest rates that you assume. And I urge everybody to study that carefully. And also that although we're trying to compare apples and other kinds of apples, we're comparing the phase 1 of the IA option with the whole thing for sewers. Because it doesn't make, if you do sewers, it doesn't make sense to do some of them and then do some later. IAs can be done any timing you want. In fact, since there are only so many contractors in town, you can possibly do them all at once. And so it's sort of a gambling thing of, do you do the more expensive thing because you might only have to do 2/3 of it? Or do you do the conservative approach that's more expensive than the 2/3 of the IA approach, but less expensive than the whole thing if you have to go that way? And that's all I want to say right now. Oh, one other question. On page 6.3, you mentioned that in principle you have to do, you don't need to find it.
Okay.
You have to allow for doing 100% of future loads. But that's impractical for different reasons for both kinds of systems. I mean, you're not going to, if somebody builds a new house, you're not going to run a new sewer line unless it happens to be right on the main line.
Mhm.
And if it's an IA, it can't do 100%. And politically, it would be absurd to say that I'm building a new house, so you also have to get a new septic system. So I assume that's covered in the, just in the safety factor.
Right.
That we've really covered the build-out ahead of time.
You are correct, right. Right, in this case, it's only 8 units, it's a small increase. If this was a half-developed watershed, it would
Right.
be much more significant. But you're right, the amount that we're picking up in the green areas is basically enough for,
And also, one little place where I think you misspoke, you said phase 1 was within the 10-year line or south of Woods Hole Road. That's not strictly true
that
because
not
that
strictly true?
triangle of yellow houses is south of Woods Hole Road, and there, the first
yeah,
triangle.
it was an and, it's both, if it's inside the 10-year and south.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all.
But yeah, there are some south of Woods Hole Road that are in phase 2.
I'd just like to make sort of a philosophical comment, and maybe it could be emphasized more. We don't have the option of no action. This is gonna cost a lot of money, how it's sliced up and divvied up, and who pays what part of it when is a factor. But obviously, we've gotten to the point where something has to be done, and I think that really needs to be emphasized going forward.
All right, are there questions from the audience for Ed? And I think we're a small enough group that we don't need to be back and forth to the podium. Just ask questions of Ed, and we'll go through the list.
Sure.
Has it been considered, and if it has, what would be the impact if Oyster Pond opens up, either due to storm surge or sea level rise in the next 20 years?
Well, in the next 20 years, I guess the projections are it's probably not any different. I mean, it's, certainly there's I think we're still nearer to the inflection point than that, but that's
No,
a good
she's-
point.
She's saying if it opened up.
Right, I mean,
If the granddaughter of Superstorm Sandy came through.
well, I was talking, I
sometime
guess I
within
was
the
hitting the
next
sea level
20
rise
years.
part first, but you're right. If there was a breach, then there would be significantly increased water exchange. It would no longer be a managed brackish system. So, well, you have a public road there, and you have a sewage force main, 24-inch, big one, that runs in that road. So if that happened and there was a breach, hopefully you'd have a pipe that wasn't also breached, but if it was, the town would, I guess at that point, you would decide whether or not you backfill it back in and reestablish Surf Drive, or whether you do something else.
I think there's
But-
a long-term plan from the
Yeah.
DPW to reroute that portion of the force main which is going through the Trunk River.
Mhm.
But that's a long time in the
So-
future.
It would be a huge decision for the town, and it would be argued loudly and widely. And there would be people saying, sea level rise, we told you it's coming. How many times are we gonna keep rebuilding Surf Drive? It was destroyed after Hurricane Bob. Are we gonna do it? I've already heard it at precinct meetings up in the north. People say, what's the bicycle trail? I actually heard that. And why should we spend any money on it?
But my question is primarily, if that happened, is there still a compulsion to reduce the nitrogen once it's open?
If it stayed open, you
Right.
wouldn't have to reduce it nearly as much, because you'd have flushing, much more flushing.
Is it Bourne's Pond that you're,
Widening the.
Falmouth is
inlet,
doing that? So that's,
yes,
from an
it would be a
engineering perspective,
huge
you're
effect.
purposefully making it wider to increase the tidal exchange, and that, in your scenario, Mother Nature takes care of that for you. It would significantly increase the tidal exchange and would result in, nobody's quantified how much reduction, what that would do to the nitrogen removal requirement. And it would change it from a freshwater to a saltwater. So, a lot of things to consider.
Totally change the pond.
Historically, we can talk about that later on, but one key aspect right now, when we went over the original considerations of should it stay freshwater type-ish low salinity versus higher salinity. There's the Water Resources Department and the state and others that want to still maintain the herring population, which it's not the greatest in respect, but it's among the second greatest output for raising herring and eels. And that would be changed in the event that it went to an open estuary situation. You'd still be subject to nitrogen reduction. It's just, as you said, you'd probably get a benefit from the flushing.
I just wanted to add a comment about that. I know one of the problems Oyster Pond had when that culvert was replaced under Surf Drive in the 80s, I think,
That's right.
and there was a greater influx of salt water. What happened is it sunk into those low areas, and then you had a lot more problems with anoxic area because the salt water was sinking to the bottom. So, maybe if there was a breachway, there'd be more flushing, but I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's a whole,
It's
right,
a whole
it's a,
thing that we don't need to go into, but.
You touched on this, but I didn't follow it completely. What is the success measure? Is it what's going on in the pond, or is it what's coming out of these systems? And the reason I'm asking is to get an understanding of if, for example, the IA systems don't quite meet the 10 milligram hurdle, but the pond is okay.
Yep.
Is that okay? Or if the pond's not okay and all the systems are meeting the 10 milligrams, what do we do?
right. So that's part of the function of the RME, to monitor and track that. So you need, based on the math, That's how we came up with the 10. So if we put in these systems and they all achieve exactly 10 milligrams per liter, by the time we achieve equilibrium, we've done what the Mass Estuaries Project said we needed to do in order to hit the number. However, if what DEP uses, so MEP is SMAST, and they kind of worked for and with DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, who says basically when you've reestablished, you've met the water quality criteria, which includes the habitat, that's when you've met the TMDL. So they have narrative criteria that engineers and scientists put numbers to try and hit that narrative criteria. So that's why in 2039, you look at all the data and you say, well, and it's the document, the RME document's written to say, we know that some of these are gonna not hit 10 all the time, and we're gonna balance those with ones that will routinely do better than 10 all the time. So there's a recognition that there's some that'll be above, some that'll be below. We're doing phase 1, which is 80% of the total, and saying we're gonna give that time to kind of re-equilibrate and then assess. And if we get to that point and we've met the water column concentration that MEP said and the habitat's reestablished and DEP says looks good, then you're done. Conversely, it could go the other way, where you do the thing that all the numbers say that you had to do, and you still haven't met the criteria, and DEP would just say, we're gonna keep working on it.
So, which brings me to my second question, which is, you may not, you probably are not the person to answer this, and I don't know if the town can answer it right now, but what happens if the technology just doesn't work well enough, and homeowners have spent the time and money to install them? Who's on the hook for spending more money to get them to meet the hurdle if the pond is still not where it needs to be? It's probably not a question for you.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know if you wanna,
I can
John?
take a crack at that. I mean, we have the things being tested at the test center and in our West Falmouth demonstration project. We're gonna have until 2024, so we're gonna have a pretty good data set that's showing these. And we now have at least 4 systems which routinely have been getting 10 or less. And so I think by the time the decision is made, we're going to have a pretty good idea of whether we can depend on these systems or not. And ultimately, the community's going to need to decide in 2024, given the data set and what we've got and the possible availability of discharge capacity in West Falmouth, do we want to put our eggs in the IA business, or do we want to say, we'll wait until we can hook up to the sewer? But I think we'll have a pretty good sense of how those systems are going to function by the time we have to make a decision.
John,
And then-
that's a really good question, Richard. What John just said is correct, but there are 2 parts of working okay. The first part is that the individual systems have to put out less than 10 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. The second part is that given that they're doing that coupled with what goes on in the ground downstream from them and biology, it has to create the change in concentration in the pond that's required. And it depends on your faith in the people that did those calculations and the variability of biology, what you believe. I mean, it probably will work, but the very absolute bottom line is the town is responsible to clean up the ponds. The getting 10 milligrams per liter is merely a way of proving to DEP that we're acting in good faith for 10 years. So we could act in good faith for 10 years. And say, hey, good guys, you're way better than Yarmouth and Dennis and Harwich and a whole lot of other places. You're doing less than 10 milligrams, but then in the end, not reach the required concentration in the pond. Then, if the town is responsible, in principle, it could put the burden on all the taxpayers of the town or just the watershed residents.
So, I would assume that phase two would take more nitrogen out. I would suppose engineering studies could calculate whether that, if the pond is not where it needs to be, but the systems are, whether adding those in, removing that nitrogen would get it there. There are areas, I guess, I've never been 100% convinced that the studies that I don't know if they're in your report or not, that said that a fairly large percentage of the nitrogen comes from the units that are closer to the pond, which makes sense. But if that calculation is off, you could meet the 10 milligrams per liter and still be pretty far off from solving the issue in the pond. Is that possible? Did I make sense?
I didn't totally follow
Yeah,
that. You're certainly right that the ones closer to the pond are generally expected to have a much bigger influence.
Right, they'll get, the nitrogen will get there sooner.
Sooner, but over a period of time, is it more? Higher percentage of the nitrogen that goes into the
It's-
systems.
It's possible.
get into the pond. Is that-
It's possible. I mean, the way DEP looks at things is they don't account for natural attenuation in the groundwater as it travels. And that's just their rule of thumb. Now, the more organics that are in the soil, the slower it travels. A case can be made that less gets there the further you are away from the water. But that's data DEP doesn't take that at face value. You need to demonstrate that to them.
I think that from the past studies that have been made of Oyster Pond and from MDL's input associated with it, and from direct flow measurements as well as estimates from the USGS for the recharge area, the statement that you've made, I'll take a more optimistic standpoint that there's a fairly concentrated 40% mass load going into the northern cove area, which as you're monitoring that and as you're seeing particularly the changes going to the septic systems which are located there, you should be able to see that
Mhm.
within your reasonable 10-year
Hmm.
period.
I would agree with that. I think I was trying to distinguish between the natural attenuation piece and straight travel time.
Yeah.
So I want to get around, there's a couple other people that had questions first.
Yeah, so this is really following up what was mentioned earlier, is that since there is a maintainability issue, which seems to fall on the homeowner in the non-traditional system, in effect, having to replace it every 20 years, 25 years, whatever. So certainly from, looking at my expenses as a homeowner, I'd much rather have the sewer because the going forward lifetime of the sewer seems like the responsibility of the town, whereas the going forward lifetime of the enhanced septic system is my responsibility. So it's not really $5,000 a year for 20 years, it's $5,000 a year forever, which is tripling my taxes. So that's for reducing the value of my home by a good chunk of money. So,
Well, the
No,
sewer,
that
you would
would-
have a sewer cost forever also, but the annual piece of the sewer cost is less than the
yeah,
on-site system.
I
Yep.
understand that, every 20 years I do a roof, every 20
Yep.
years I do a septic, sure, I know, but this is
Yep.
this is substantial, and certainly, from my viewpoint, I might vastly prefer a sewer system if it was a one-time thing, and then I don't have to keep maintaining it over and over again, whereas a septic system, I've got to keep doing that, and letting you in the property all the time to do it. So it's a big encumbrance.
Mhm.
So anyway, I just wanted to make sure I understood that right, and that hopefully the committee is taking into account not only the cost to the town, but the cost to the 200-odd homeowners that are involved here.
Mhm.
And whether in fact it's fair for them to, what's fair for them to bear
I think one of the things you should think about, I mean, if we're talking about a low-pressure sewer system, you're going to need to provide access to have that pumping unit serviced. And I'm not sure, historically in Little Pond, the town provided the initial pump. I'm not sure how the maintenance was set up. Amy, is that maintenance covered by the town of those low-pressure pumps?
I'm Amy Lowell, I'm the wastewater superintendent, and, yeah, the Board of Selectmen voted that the town would take responsibility for maintenance for the grinder pumps, even past the 5-year warranty. Right now, the pumps are all under warranty, but the Board of Selectmen said that the town would be responsible, and in fact, that the town would replace those pumps, when they got to the end of their 20-year life, which is a pretty big commitment. It is important to remember when comparing them, though, that it is, you're talking about an IA system compared to a grinder pump system and it's not IA system compared to gravity. So with the grinder pump system, there is a pump on your property and an alarm panel, and, there is, potential maintenance requirement and all that. Sometimes people may be more used to a gravity sewer system and think of it that way when we're talking about sewer, but what you discussed
Right.
here is a low-pressure sewer
Right.
alternative.
And some folks like to have, you might have a generator if you're in that situation too, where you want to make sure, a lot of times you either size the thing that you put the pump in bigger to accommodate times when you don't have power, or have a generator for your house, which is small, but a lot of people have generators already.
There's also a scheme, I don't know if Amy, I think Amy implemented this. The idea that if you have a Hurricane Bob situation where power is out for a week and a number of people don't have generators, you don't have to be pumping continuously, because your tank has got several days capacity.
Right.
So the town could have a generator on a truck and go around and give everybody half an hour of power,
Right, a boost.
and then drive down the road. That's standard stuff.
So I don't want to divert too much into grinder pumps, but I will say, the pumps that we've installed in Little Pond don't have days worth of capacity. It's actually a pretty small storage tank, and Board of Selectmen did say that we would provide, basically a generator service, so we don't pump out your tank, but we plug a generator into your control panel so that the pump will pump, your tank out, and that gives you, say, 16, 17 flushes or so. It's a 24-hour pump out, not a 3-day.
So you get help, but you have to be
You have to-
frugal.
Yes.
Okay.
And the other issue is if there's a hurricane situation, access to all the properties is affected. So, we will certainly do the best we can to meet that commitment. There will potentially be limitations.
Amy, what is your position again? I didn't-
Wastewater superintendent.
Oh, great. Good person.
I understand that the 5,200 a year is maintaining the IA system, right? Over a 20-year period.
It includes the cost of a loan if you had it, so you have the debt service for paying for the pieces that the homeowner would need to pay for, plus the maintenance cost.
Oh,
So it's not the capital cost plus that, that's the annualized cost
okay.
to use the system, have the system.
What is, at this point in time, the approximate cost of putting in a system, an IA system?
The number that we used, I believe, was $30,000 for the pieces of the IA system.
So,
And then there's pieces around that, like the town, diving into that a bit, the town would provide, the way we talked about it is the town would provide the treatment stuff,
right.
the equipment that would need to be installed on the property, but the homeowner would pay for the installation. The homeowner would obviously have private property stuff, landscaping. If you have to take care of your own septic tank because it's already been there for 50 years, that kind of stuff would be there as well. But there was a cost-sharing arrangement that was part of the plan.
I just have a follow-up question. What, I'm not saying I there aren't going to be homeowners, if we get to this point in 2025, who say, I can't afford to do this. And what kind of enforcement procedures or what legal procedures does the town have to make somebody do that?
I guess, John, you know more than that. I guess it's the same as if you don't pay taxes or you don't pay your water bill or your.
I mean, if we had situations like that in Little Pond, Amy?
So ultimately, there are out of 1,350 properties that are required to connect to the sewer, there are about 10 left that we're still working on. And of those, there are a few that are up against, that appear to be up against that issue. And the town has yet to deal with somebody who really truly could not afford it one way or another. Most property owners have worked it out either through, the county has a septic system, or they call it the septic loan program. A lot of property owners have taken advantage of a loan to get their sewer connection made. Really, we have not, the town has not had a system yet for helping property owners pay. Really, what we've done is force people to connect. I've been sending out citations to property owners that didn't connect and going to court to require people to connect. So not more than 95% have figured out a way to do that.
Did you have a question too?
Yeah, in my own mind, I think the same thing has been said different ways here. I'm comparing cost and risk analysis. And on one side, we have this AI system that we think is some indication it's going to be satisfactory. We don't know that. On the other hand, as far as I know, a sewage treatment system, conventional sewage treatment system, is well understood. So we have a higher cost system here and a lower cost system, an operating cost. This one we're not sure about. This one we're relatively sure about. And at the same time, you had indicated there are several ponds like Oyster Pond that have nitrogen issues. So I would assume that at some point in time, more central sewage treatment will have to be constructed one way or another. So I'm having trouble understanding why a conventional sewage treatment system doesn't make more sense than doing this AI. And just my machinery background says when you have 225 systems, about 100 of them are going to be breaking all the time, one way or the other. And I'm quite familiar with the grinder pump system. This system was manufactured first almost 30 years ago. It's well developed, highly reputable manufacturer, and they work well. They break down, but infrequently. So I'm having trouble understanding why the comparison risk-cost analysis doesn't come more in favor of a central sewage treatment system.
Could I comment, Ed?
Sure.
So basically, when we have to make a decision in 2025, we have a treatment plant in West Falmouth that we can treat all the sewage in the world there. But the permit that the state issues for that central treatment plant is based on our ability to discharge the water, treated water that we put through that plant. And one of the really fundamental issues that the town is going to have to deal with in the future as we begin to sewer things down on the south coast is how are we going to add that discharge capacity so that we can add places like, for instance, Oyster Pond. So if at 2025 we get to a point where we simply don't have the ability to discharge from that plant what we would be adding from Oyster Pond, that precludes us from sewering. So this is all something that we've got to work out as a town over the next years as we begin to work our way through these systems.
John, you want to pick?
Bill, you haven't gone yet.
Yeah, have some comments to you that we three comments that would come up on the aspect that I think you have done that now on the 22-acre land. You clearly pointed out that OPEB
Mhm.
bought the land and made the adjustments associated with the acquisition of that, not adding additional
Right.
residential areas. Only question came up associated with that is that on the laying down of the collector systems from and I know we all agree that you have to go with the pumping system because it would be crazy with
Yep.
the moraine.
Right, too many lift stations,
Try
yeah.
to put in gravity systems. That you do still have the main combination of them going through that area of about 40 acres, of which there are really just two houses that fit within those regions, so that the
Mhm.
cost of conveyance, certainly during that particular area, looks a little bit strange.
There are some stretches, especially through that area, where there's a fair amount of length with no services.
Yeah.
But there's no other way to get flow from the southwest corner of the pond all the way around without going through Surf Drive, which for the reasons that were stated earlier, we don't really want to put infrastructure in Surf Drive. It was get it up and over. So
Yeah.
there's some points of refinement there that could happen.
The other one, which you haven't addressed, and that's fine, but
Mhm.
you're at the focus at the present time in the material, has to do with the phosphorus
Mhm.
situation. So we have been checking, and what George and Mass Tech has been doing on measuring phosphorus removal in the Title V system. So we went back to, okay, how much phosphorus really is being made? Because it really wasn't, no one paid attention to that
Right.
beforehand. And I've got some of the data that George gave us, but it's clear that you do have phosphorus removal within the Title V system.
Yeah, I think the numbers are pretty low, though. It's in from the number, I haven't seen those numbers, but the historic numbers are in the 10% range. It's not,
Well, it's more than you think, so
Okay.
I included that.
okay,
It
good.
starts out at actually 50%, and then after a period of 10 years, if you consider.
Oh, yeah,
5
yeah.
foot.
You're talking about in the soil.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
this is counting the, going through the storage vessel, and then the standard 5-foot leaching field
Mhm.
area, and how much is removed within that system. So yes, it's absorption in the bed
Yeah.
situation, and it decreases with time, as you might expect. The
Right.
mean ended up being about 36%.
Mhm.
But it does start out at 50 and go to 20.
Yep.
And then when you take into account also large lot situations in terms of their recharge, you go to situations where if your system, Title V system, is back 100 feet to 200 feet from the water's edge, you can have 95%
Mhm.
removal if you go to the plume situation.
Right. There's a fair possibility that virtually none of the wastewater phosphorus has even hit the pond yet.
Yeah. I know we were way back when.
We digress.
We were putting
Yeah.
monitoring wells in 2000. Oh, no, I'm not seeing that much of a
Right.
phosphorus increase at
Yep.
all. So it seemed to, but the point is, back in your reporting on the 2017 and 2014, you had in it that there's no removal associated with phosphorus.
Yeah, I think the point you're looking at is the removal that is referencing there was between the Blackwater pipe coming into the septic tank and what was leaving the septic tank. It wasn't, we know that phosphorus travels, it gets bound in the soils until the soil receptor sites are filled, basically, and then it starts migrating. So there's significant removal for a period of time, and then there's little to no removal
Yeah,
after that.
I could understand the 10% just
Yeah.
for the holding tank.
Yep.
But George took it to be the leaching field there
Mhm.
to add.
Yep.
Material. And then just the update on the installation cost of an IA system, which it sounded like you were talking to the same person, John, because he's heading toward the 35
I think they're using the model from the West Falmouth demonstration project.
Yeah.
To give an idea. So I think one has reasonable confidence in those numbers certainly in today's dollars.
Yeah, George was updating me on 22,000 right now for he was mainly focusing on those related to the CHIPS systems of various forms, but particularly to the enclosed Nitrex chip system. But it's 22,000, and then the only other aspect we talked about to make sure that we had the phosphorus removal might want to include leaching field area just
I think
last
we want
Yeah.
Title V, and that would add another 3,500. So when you're starting adding the little component parts, and you have someone like Botello doing it.
Mhm.
So that all assumes, though, that you don't encounter site-specific difficulties with regard to this.
And this is why we say $30,000.
Yeah,
So that's reasonable. I think we're getting to the point where we need to tidy up this discussion. We've got a fairly long agenda this afternoon. Are there other really pressing questions that you have for Ed?
Yeah, my question was, of the 168 IA systems, how many are planned for treetops? And are they different in size than the others? And finally, due to that, is there a dwelling unit difference in terms of
The way we figured treetops is we said 16 units. So basically, right now, generally speaking, I think the buildings have 2 septic tanks per building. And we said we'll consolidate that to 1 treatment system per building.
so one per building? Okay.
Right.
And
And that was the range could have been 1 per dwelling unit, which would have been crazy, or 1 for the whole treetops, which wouldn't really be an IA system. It would be, given the flow, it would be more of
so
it'd be a different kind of
So
thing.
the cost per unit would be divided into, like, if there were 5 units,
Right.
then you divide that.
Correct.
No, we have to speak to that. In principle, that means that the per dwelling unit cost would be 1/4. Not quite, because it's got to be bigger, because you've got 4 times as many bedrooms. But so many of the fixed costs would be reduced, would be amortized, the same fixed cost amortized over 4 dwelling units instead of 1, that you'd expect the cost to go down substantially. And I once brought up the fact that, well then, wouldn't the treetops individual dwellings get a smaller per dwelling unit annual fee from the town? And not everyone agreed with that.
I think, just thinking about that, DEP considers treetops one property. And your discharge exceeds 10,000 gallons per day. So they're going to have an individual discharge permit for treetops. And their monitoring for that system is probably going to be more rigorous than what we're talking about for the individual ones. So I think if you're thinking that we should, in that sort of a scenario, that we would have a reduced monitoring scheme, I think on average it's going to work out to be about the same as the individual houses, because DEP is going to be more restrictive about
Is
it.
the 10,000 the max or the median?
I'm not
Ten-
sure, John,
10
I think that's only true if you have only 1 or 2 systems serving the 62 dwelling units.
It's a
If you have 16, then there's 16 separate systems. Each one is way below 10,000.
No, I don't think that's true.
That's
The way
not true.
DEP looks at it is they consider it a parcel, and I think treetops kind of snuck under the radar in terms of not already having a individual groundwater discharge permit, so I think you would have an individual permit.
I just want to clarify one thing. I raised this at a meeting, maybe this summer meeting. I've had some very, very preliminary conversations with some people about options for treetops, and have had discussions about a 1 or 2 system approach,
Mhm.
large system. I can't remember the fellow's name now, sorry, but he also looked into this statement that treetops is more than 10,000 gallons, and he said he's not so sure that's true. So I don't know, I mean, I'll assume it's true, but if it's not or if it is, I guess it doesn't really matter. Does the town care, well, they care, but does the town have some prohibition or restriction around how treetops would address this issue? If we do one large system, two.
I think that's something that when we get to the decision point in 2025, Treetops will, in conjunction with that management entity, will need to sit down and figure out with their engineer what is, so part of this whole IA scheme is the individual homeowner will pay the engineering costs for each parcel, figuring out how they're going to do it. And Treetops would have the same thing, and so they would sit down with their engineer and they would say, okay, what's the best way for us to treat these 64 units which constitute Treetops? And that's not something that we need to think about today. It's something that Treetops is gonna need to think about over the next 10 years.
But Richard is asking, do we care? And the answer is no. I mean, the working group has discussed that, and if you have something that meets all the criteria where it's just one or two systems, go for it.
We don't, but it's possible. It's
Yeah.
been put out.
Right, and we talked about a number of different scenarios in terms of how do we develop a cost estimate to consolidate a plan, to present it to a group that to committees that represent the town on behalf of whatever, 165 parcels, home property owners. So it's, how that comes back apart into implementation is really a separate discussion. It was really bringing the stuff together to provide a typical dwelling unit cost. But that, Treetops was specifically discussed in terms of 1, 2, 16.
A big percentage of the watershed, and I know it's been thought of. I just want to say one thing, John, is the individual homeowners don't matter. Treetops is one association, and they won't pay anything. They will just pay a vastly increased monthly fee to the association. That's the only way the association gets money, I would guess, unless, you're going to do this through a betterment on the tax bill or something else.
Well, typically, the maintenance and would come from your water use bill. In other words, the sewer charges that we assess, the houses that are on the sewer system, are figured from the water use of each unit. And so I assume that we would do the same thing. And so that,
For the $5,000 per dwelling fee?
no, we're talking about, there's going to be an annual sewer charge. And if you're hooked to our sewer now, that is figured through your individual water use. So that if you have a neighbor that uses twice as much water as you do, he's charged twice as much for the sewer. And I assume that that part of the maintenance program that will be assessed to each dwelling unit by their water charge. And that won't vary whether you have an IA system or a sewer. And we're trying to figure those charges so that they're reasonably equitable, so that someone who has a house on the Little Pond sewer is paying a certain fee per year, and I don't know what that ends up being, Amy, is it, what that average fee?
Water use, I want to say $580
Yeah.
a year on average. If
So you could assume that you're going to have then a charge, and that charge, when we're thinking about the IAs, would be to cover the monitoring, the pumping of your septic system, those annual fees, and that would be part of a fee which each dwelling unit would be assessed through its water usage. Okay, I think if there are no further questions for Ed, thanks, Ed, and
Okay.
I think we'd like to move on to the rest of our agenda.
Kristen, will you have a copy of the slide deck that Ed's used for
I
this?
do.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's on the desktop.
all right, thank you.
Whatever.
Can you
Yeah.
post
Are you leaving now, or are you staying for the rest of the meeting?
I'm not saying for the whole thing, but I'm gonna stay for a few minutes. Do you,
I just had one question.
Thank you all.
You know,
Appreciate all your hard work. Yeah.
Must be the August afternoon blues.
So, Kirsten, I guess we're just going to go through those chapters that we have, 5 to...
Yep.
5, 11, and 12.
We've got Amy here for chapter 5. Alright. So, same deal as always. What you have in front of you are all the comments that I received. So there was some updating that Amy and GHD did further on related to the plant. But first round on the first page is pretty much just some wordsmithing. Up until Steve's first comment on the second page. About discharge.
Yeah, my comment is, so the real total is 710,000. Why are we always saying just 450,000 and neglecting the 260,000? There's probably a good reason, but it was just confusing to me.
I'm not sure what you mean, why are we always saying that? The 400,
Maybe not you, but
it's 450 within the West Falmouth Harbor watershed. And
and the other 260 is,
north of the West Falmouth Harbor watershed. So our permit really does have both those numbers.
but as far as what can come into the sewage plant, which is the bottom line, it doesn't know where it's gonna go when it comes in. And so, in terms of the amount of sewers you can connect to it, that's limited by the 700 and,
The total capacity, total discharge capacity is 710. But we have a very, we have this division within our permit that says how that has to be divided between the two watersheds.
I hear you, I just,
Yep, you're right, 710 is our total limit.
okay, thank you.
And that again is the discharge limit, not the treatment limit. We right now have a plant that was built to handle 1.2 million gallons a day.
So,
Right, oh, yeah, no, I've heard people on this committee, I won't name any names, say, oh, we're getting so close to the 450,000, we're gonna have to stop. And then suddenly I read this for the first time, I say, whoa, it's 710,000.
well, so the 450,
Because right now,
it is, I'm gonna move up a little because I'm distracted by the, the history of those two is that the 400 is generally, 450 is from our existing sewer service area, and the additional 260 is from the Little Pond sewer service area. And both those numbers we're eating away at both of those numbers over time. So
So it's not like we have a secret reserve.
right. So,
Fair enough.
yeah, we're close to 450 from our existing sewer service area. We are getting closer to the 260 from LPSA. They're both going up, so.
And I think, Amy, the corollary to that is, as we approach 80% of that 720,000 gallons, we have to notify DEP how we will add additional capacity in the future.
And we, through this CWMP, that's one of the things I was trying to do in this chapter was give them that notification. This chapter really is part of that notification. It's, we're very, I expect to be at that point in the next couple of years. So through a paragraph in this chapter, I'm telling you that.
So we don't, you can ignore my comment because this chapter is on the West Falmouth watershed, so
Yes.
it's perfectly fine, so thank you. All I meant is that if there's a little safety factor in the 260 and a little safety factor in the 450, we're entitled to both those safety factors.
I had a question for Amy. So our discharge permit is written for that 720,000
710.
gallons.
Yes.
Do they also attach a nitrogen pounds per year into that permit?
Yes, so the way the permit is written, it has it's a very unusual and strict permit. But we have flow limitations, an average annual flow limitations are the numbers we've been talking about. We also have a max day number for each of those watersheds. Then we have a max day nitrogen limit of 10. And we have an average annual best efforts target of 3 milligrams per liter total nitrogen. Then we also have a load best efforts target, which is calculated just by multiplying 3 by 450,000 gallons. 3 milligrams per liter times 450,000 gallons per day, and putting in the conversion factors gives you an annual load to the West Falmouth Harbor watershed of 4,109 pounds per day. And so that number is written in our permit as well. Both the 3 milligrams per liter total nitrogen concentration and the 4,109 pounds per year
Per year?
load target are written as best efforts, meaning they are not at this point a hard limit. And that was a result of the town's appeal process on the last permit. The town, we don't need to get into it too much, but the town appealed the last permit for a number of reasons. And one is that 3 is a limit of technology limit, and it's very difficult. And we said our goal is to meet that, but we can't go into this saying, you can fine us whatever number of dollars a day if we don't meet that, because that is it's a pushing the envelope kind of limit. So we do have a load number in our permit. It is not it's not a limit, it's a best efforts target at this point. This permit expired, we will have to apply for a new permit in September. You have to apply 6 months ahead of time. So this permit will be back under discussion in March of 2020.
Next changes are in table 5.1, and that's just the addition of the 1,242 kilograms per year, and basically reformatting the notes at the bottom of the table. Steve has a question on the next page about whether all Little Pond sewer service area has been connected.
Amy answered that, I guess, in the previous presentation. I thought that we had been told they'd all been connected, but there's still 10 to go. Okay, so forget that comment.
So then we have comments from Steve
And
and
that was just
Tom.
me venting, that's, there's a flip side to that, too. That if something goes wrong with the IAs, then you have to fix hundreds of things.
And Tom wants to know what the normal values are.
Well, trying to think how to say that. Our effluent is close to 3 milligrams per liter right now. It has averaged above that for the last month. It's been, I'd say, 3.6, 3.8.
Well, I was just gonna say return to a range of 3 to 4 or something, I thought was better than just saying normal, because we have, we have people reading this who don't know the background and don't, but I just thought if we substituted 3 to 4, or whatever we think is the appropriate range there.
Let's get the low, and then that'll show you're within 3. So what is it, 2.5?
So, part of the problem in writing this chapter is that we're writing it now, and this is gonna go to the state in December, and, so this right now will
So, right, I guess what yeah, I mean, we could give a range, but it,
Well, aren't the normal values in table 5.1 for 2017 and 2018? I mean, if you wanted to,
that's, I mean, 27 and 18 and 2017 and 2018 were excellent years, and those, yeah, that was the average for those years. Right now, you know, we have now just a month or so of data since the plan. Return to what I would call normal, and it's 3.8, you know, we can put something, I can put something in there,
but I'm saying I'm happy with the way it is, because somebody reads that and says return to normal. If they want to know what normal is, they go back to table 5.1 and look at the previous 2 years for which you have a full year of data.
Or you could say something along the lines of return to the anticipated ranges, as opposed to normal.
say 2.5 to 4. I mean, that's 2.5
I don't
to
care.
4 is
Yeah, return to the expected range of 2.5 to 4. And since
You
you have
guys have to
you're
decide.
dating it, because you've got the June 2019 in there, so you can be specific since you have the date.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, that's good.
So return to the expected range of 2.5 to 4.0.
Normal range of 2.5 to 4 million.
So no expected. The normal. Good. Some more minor wordsmithing. So we've got a comment from Tom about the graph.
Amy, before, I have a mental image of like I think before you presented this, like one figure that was like a full page and it had the 6 stacked one on top of the other.
6 graphs.
Yeah, 6 separate graphs, because I got lost right away here. And I just thought that was a easier way, because for one thing, I think it's easier to see the time course of the changes over time in the different, I just thought this was complicated.
This is a lot on one graph. However, so I know that you were frustrated that I didn't plot, basically make it predictive.
Right, yeah, I don't need the predictive part now. This was just in terms of simplifying
Yeah,
this.
so part of what I like about this is that it does show the entire, it's a long time frame.
Right.
A long time period of monitoring, and those wells have behaved differently over time. So if
Right.
you were gonna put in, and some of them actually are newer wells, like we don't have data from all of them for the entire period. Yeah, if you were gonna split them up, you definitely wanna show them over the same time period. You could have 6 different
Yeah.
graphs. Is that, are we missing one in the, 1, 2, 3, 4? No, it is 6. I thought we were missing one in the legend. So you'd rather see it as 6 graphs?
I just thought that was easier to see. You put them all on the same time course, and
One thing I wanted to point out here is that, again, it's a long time period.
yes,
The last few years, since we did the upgrades, are really the very tail end of the graph.
right, that's where the excitement is.
Right, I mean, it is a little overwhelming, you see 30 years of data, and, you know, there's a lot of movement in it. If you look in the last 5 years, 3 to 5 years, 5 of those wells are very low.
Yeah, I like that.
Right,
Yeah.
so that's sort of what I was trying to get at with the descriptions, was to focus in on, you know, all of them had a peak in the past.
Yep.
And they've all come down.
Yep.
To a much more reasonable point.
That's why I think this is a reasonable way of doing that, Tom.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, I don't know whether Amy, if you put a big red circle around that 5 years and emphasize in the legend, you know, that you can see quite dramatically how those wells have decreased in that since we've upgraded that plant.
Yeah, maybe make an arrow or something that says, here's where the
Just
upgrades
like a
occurred.
horizontal bar in the upper, there's space for it, in the upper right corner that covers the last 5 years, and a note right on it says, note, in the last 5 years, look how great we are. No, I'm just kidding. Look how low the values are.
I did want to, can we look real quick at the first page? This figure 5.1 on the first page, it's trying to show a lot on one figure, and it perhaps not the most beautiful thing in the world. But the point, there was an edit made in the sentence above it. I had said the location of treated wastewater recharge from the wastewater plant is very substantially over area and time. Maybe what I should have said is over location and time. But part of my point is that the reason I didn't want to use the time of, I didn't want to use the time of detection in each of the wells as predictive is that the discharge has really varied over time, not just time, but where that discharge has been, and the wells are not in a straight line down gradient of the discharge. The wells are spread over a larger area, so they really aren't going to see the same portion of the plume or behave exactly the same over time. So we can add something to that graph that shows here's when we upgraded the plant, but monitoring well 19, which is that higher one, the higher concentration one, is is much farther down gradient.
Yes.
So it's going to see that effect much later.
Are you then saying you don't want that word change on that first page?
I would prefer to say over location and,
No, the way you fixed it is better because you already have a location at the beginning of the sentence. It doesn't make any sense to say the location has varied over location.
you're absolutely right. What I wrote was redundant. So it's varied over.
Over the years, it's nice,
You like that?
yeah. I don't like the picture, the map, because my eyes are getting old and but I think even if I was younger, I'd need a magnifying glass too.
Well, Steve,
I could have somebody.
what I did was, I
exploded.
printed a big one and started marking it up.
So I made this. I think GHD can really make it better.
Okay.
We'll take that on.
Well,
Like
there's a lot of,
We need to get into
yeah, Anastasia, there's a lot of clutter, but what I did as soon as I got this, I printed this page up full size and started marking it up, because, as you said, it is complicated. There's not a long, straight, simple gradient down, and, yeah, there's a lot of extra clutter in here, like street names and other things that we don't need here. I think the key thing would be to show where the inputs were, obviously show where the wells are now, show the watershed boundaries, because that's important in a discussion about moving the stuff outside of the West Falmouth watershed, and the boundaries of West Falmouth Harbor.
Yeah, it's amazing by just changing the colors a little bit, we can tell it's
Yeah, you're
spread
right,
out.
street names
E-
are probably not.
Yeah,
I wanted to show, right, input locations
Yeah.
all over the place, and then where the wells are relative to the input locations and to the watershed boundaries and to West Falmouth Harbor. It's a lot of information, but this chapter's trying to cover all that.
yes, oh, yeah.
But if we can go back to figure 5.2 again, Amy, I think your point is really good, that all except for 19 have come way down in the last 5 years. I mean,
And that's to be expected.
but in the caption of the picture doesn't say that anywhere. The way you just expressed it verbally is perfect, but
Um,
it's not in the text, is it? Or is it somewhere else?
Well, it is in the text, but it's not in the the figure caption.
Because the caption, well, I mean, there's the caption in bold blue, and then there's the non-bold black below it that sort of looks like part of the caption. I
That's
don't know
actually
whether
just
you're
text.
considering all of that the caption.
No,
but
that's just text.
That's just text. the
Neither
body
of those
text.
make the good point that you just made. That no one, it doesn't draw the attention of the reader to your point that
So,
most of the values have come way down. If anything, it implies, it talks about increasing slightly over time, blah, blah, blah.
So page 5, or this, I don't know, are you guys looking at the one with the revision marks?
Yep.
Yeah, so on page 5,
Doesn't have page numbers.
On the bottom, on the very bottom
right?
of the actual GHD text.
Oh, okay, which
Yeah.
page? Yes, I
Right,
see.
5-5, the sentence that starts figure 5.2 shows that total nitrogen concentration in the downgradient wells increased, I said at a point after the original plant began operating, then decreased in recent years after the tertiary plant began operating.
Okay, you're all set.
The part of the problem, I think, is the location of the figure relative to the text.
Thank
Can
you.
we just move it?
What, Amy, what about if within the figure, could you scroll it back down a little bit, Kristen? We just put a vertical arrow, that's January of '06, right?
Sure.
That was Tom's point, that there's like,
My brain waves.
Yeah, and just put, tertiary treatment for nitrate or something initiated.
the point.
'Cause that's the key thing in this graph, I think.
Yes,
Which is
Take
a
home
weird
message.
place.
yeah.
It's all going
Yeah,
down,
big
which
one,
is a good thing.
Yeah.
But it's not really obvious until somebody points it out.
And Amy, is it worth noting that the high value at the end is 19, which is at Mashapaquet Creek, which is the furthest monitoring well from the plant? So
So it's
you,
not at Mashapaquet Creek.
No.
It's right on Snug Harbor, and it is the furthest, and it does say that. I did go on about monitoring wells.
Yeah, it's,
Excessively, perhaps.
Oh, no.
Total nitrogen in monitoring well 19, which is furthest down gradient from recharge, immediately adjacent to West Falmouth Harbor, began it in blah, blah, blah. So that's at the bottom of page 5.5.
okay.
For somebody who has the patience to talk about each well, or the more important wells, it does say that.
I think it's fine. I mean, this is arcane stuff. Nobody's gonna read this as bedtime reading. If you're reading this at all, you gotta be willing to read the details.
So on details, Tom's, the other half of his comment is on the note on the bottom of the graph about what the implications are for those outliers.
That was when the TKN, basically the data didn't make sense, and it made spikes, so
Yep.
it was a data error, and it would have artificially influenced this.
yeah,
Yeah.
We talked quite a bit about this ahead of time. When I presented the data to the committee last, when was that, November?
yeah.
I presented nitrate data, because nitrate is really what's moving in the groundwater, and the graphs are much cleaner. Total nitrogen isn't just nitrate, obviously, it's TKN plus nitrate plus nitrite. Well, there's never any nitrite in the groundwater. There is sometimes a little bit of TKN in the groundwater, but the lab, this is, again, it's 30 years of monitoring data, and the town has had a number of labs over time do the analysis, and there has been some irregularity periodically in the monitoring well TKN data. And we do send in blanks with our monitoring well samples, and those sometimes have had erroneous TKN values in them at the same time. So we were trying with this, the footnote here indicates that we basically, we deleted the highest, these true outlier TKN numbers, and kept the rest in because the graph basically shows the same thing either way. It shows higher numbers and then lower numbers.
Yep.
And so, I didn't need to finesse whether the TKN was probably wrong, in a lot of the others as well. We removed the ones that really took the total off the chart. They were so erroneous.
Yep.
Should we add a note at the end of that that says something to the extent of this removal doesn't influence the trend? The trend is the same. just to
That's right.
clarify
It was you and I
that.
that talked about
Yeah,
this.
it was
I'm
you
sorry,
and I.
You called me about this, I forgot. Sure. We've changed labs twice
Mhm.
because of challenges with TKN numbers. And our current lab is better at keeping TKN within, having non-detect TKN when there should be non-detect TKN, but it's still not perfect. So,
Mhm.
so removal does not affect the trend.
Next
Overall.
Yep, overall trend. The next comment is Tom about the y-axis starting on the phosphorus graph.
I know it's nice to have the same scaling to make the figures readily comparable.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that
It's not a big deal. I just looked at it and I go, wow, there's a
Yeah, I had
little
the
noise
same-
down here at the bottom.
I had the same comment somewhere else.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a different quantity. There's no magic reason why phosphorus concentration should be in the same ballpark as nitrogen concentration.
Yep.
right, it's fine. I think we can, I don't want to reduce it down to the point where these numbers look like they're spiking when they are basically just very low background numbers.
Yes.
You know, if you took the scale down to 2, then it would look like there's some look more like there's meaningful data here.
It looked like a major disturbance. Yeah, I can understand.
And
But
I
it-
also
but it-
I don't want to make it look like phosphorus concentrations are this. I just know when people look at graphs, if the scales are dramatically different, people compare peaks that are equivalent. And
Yeah.
Right.
these concentrations are, as you're saying, much lower than the
Yep.
nitrogen concentration.
Yeah, it's
But
not
it-
a big deal. I
So we
just,
can do a compromise.
But it can also, if you see this, you can also start to think, is the person cheating? You know, there's a book called How to Lie with Statistics, I recommend to everybody. It's a really old book. But, and this is one of the techniques, is, you know, pick a y-axis to make anything bad look negligible. And, or vice versa. And, if you cut it down to with the other way around it is to have some kind of horizontal line that represents some figure of merit, like what the goal is, or what's the average in the country, or something.
So we can make the scale something like 5.
And it also applies to the one on the next page, and the page after that.
So I think it's important to keep the total nitrogen scale the same for the 2 graphs. So the figure 5.3 is total phosphorus, figure 5.4 is total nitrogen,
yeah.
but it's the wells that are downgrading at the newest beds. And I think when we're comparing like
So that makes
constituents,
sense,
the
yeah.
scale ought to be the same.
Yep.
The difference is that figure 5.4, those wells have never seen the discharge from the original wastewater plant, so it doesn't go up to the same numbers. But I do understand that it can look like like we're cheating. But if the phosphorus numbers are low, there are detections in there. I'm not trying to say it's not detected. I was just trying to show where it was relative to nitrogen. But I think we can change the scale.
Is there,
Certainly
is
to
there,
10 and maybe to something lower than that.
is there a state mandated level that phosphorus shouldn't exceed?
So, not really. We don't have a phosphorus limit in our permit. We are required monitor.
But you have the best efforts goal of 3, right?
That's for nitrogen.
That's
Right,
nitrogen.
right. So on the 2 nitrogen graphs, if you drew a horizontal line at 3, well,
That is in our effluent. We have a best efforts goal of effluent nitrogen at 3. And it's, yeah, I would definitely not want to make a red line through the,
okay.
That's a red line.
Yes,
no red line.
the red line you don't want to cross, right?
Yeah.
So Matt also has a comment right below figure 5.3 about where those phosphorus numbers came from. The 2.7 to 4.3 in table 5.1, when the graph above it doesn't show any data above 1.
So that's because you're monitoring in two different places. It's the effluent versus what you're picking up in the wells.
Right, the two different sources.
Yeah. So it would make sense that the effluent would be higher.
Sure.
Because it binds in the soil, you don't detect it in the well.
Okay.
So y-axis, we already commented on that.
Yeah, so we'll change the y-axis and
Yep.
the two phosphorus graphs.
So Matt highlighted that range again, but we just discussed that on 5.10. So Tom's comment for the bar graph about compressing the axis.
I just thought it'd be helpful, and again, these could be, you know, the y-axis could be compressed to make the thing, but I just thought it would be nice to put in the 0.35 to show that we haven't hit it at any of them. Things are looking a little bit better more recently, but that would be a red line, Amy, we could put in.
Yeah, I mean, we could also add a note, I guess rather than, I would prefer instead of a line that we put a note on the, chart that says target,
Yeah.
threshold concentration at sentinel location or at this location is 0.35. It says it in the text, but it doesn't show it in the graph, so.
Yeah, I like the figures to speak for themselves as
Sure.
much as possible.
Just some minor wordsmithing. So 5.2.2 is where there was an addition that was worked out with GHD and Amy.
So maybe could we, to talk about that, maybe we should go to the table at the end,
Yep.
table 5.4. So somebody asked the question,
John.
John Waterbury asked the question, and I'm glad you did, because to be honest, I hadn't reevaluated the numbers in table 5.4. So you'd asked a question of Kristen, I guess, about table 5.4, where did the wastewater treatment improvement loading reduction number come from? And it was a good question, and when the answer was that GHD had based it on the performance over the past couple of years that were shown in the table earlier. And what I believe that what we should say is that we can achieve a load reduction from our plant that reflects 3 milligrams per liter times 450,000 gallons a year. And so that's the new number here, is the load reduction that you achieve if you assume we meet our load target. Did I explain that well enough? Do you understand what I'm saying? So basically, the number there, it's not a huge change in the numbers, but the original 8,792 number was assuming that we average like 2.6 milligrams per liter of total nitrogen and discharge a lower flow rate. And that was just what we did over the last couple of years. Really, the load reduction that we ought to be committing to is the target that's in the permit. So that changes the number for the wastewater treatment plant changes the total. It still is within what the MEP said we need to achieve. And we added a paragraph under 5.2.2 to explain that.
that pretty much covers the comments for chapter 5.
We haven't done 11 and 12 yet?
I apologize, I
Amy,
didn't know it was
one thing before you disappear,
Yes, sir.
do you have a electronic version of our discharge permit?
Yeah, you asked me for that last week, and I was on vacation, so let me,
You could just send me that to my email address, that'd be great.
I saw the email when I was on vacation, I should have made it a, you should never look at email and then not address it immediately.
You should not look at email on vacation, Amy.
Anything else on that one? Okay, I apologize, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Amy. Would you like to call a vote on this, Mr. Chairman?
Okay. You want to be chairman for a little longer?
No, you go ahead.
He's doing a fine job, Eric.
That's why I came back. I want to make sure there was no usurpation going on here. All right, the comments on the chapter 5 of the comprehensive wastewater management plan update having been addressed and amendments proposed, all in favor of the presentation as amended, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. We move on to chapter 11. What do we know about chapter 11? And she's going to do that. Ed, I don't think you have to stay. You're certainly welcome to listen to paint dry here, but
I'm not gonna stay. I gotta go to a meeting tonight in Sandwich.
that's right, okay. And we'll see you again on
You
Monday.
driving there right now?
Thrilled for the intervening time.
All right. Did they have anything that we should know about? Just while
They
you're
made
here?
some good comments.
They did.
I think that the working group, I mean, there were some little things that I didn't want to bother the
Yeah.
neighbors with, but that should be talked about for
Well, you're
our
coming to
policy
town on
report.
Monday.
I am.
Do you want to meet with your working group again before you see the selectmen? Is that enough time for everybody to think about this? I guess you've all
Yeah,
thought
yeah,
about
well,
it.
some of it is
Up to you.
is policy. I mean, I don't know if you want to waste Ed's time with that, but I don't mind if Ed is there. It
Actually,
doesn't
I
matter.
have to go to Mashpee. Yeah, I mean, we could get together for an hour or so.
I'm gonna
late
be
in the
off.
afternoon.
You're off?
Yep.
Not available? Okay, well, if he's not available, maybe this isn't such a hot idea.
Monday, the 5th in the morning, I will not be available.
Okay. What's your time frame if you were to come to do this?
Say late afternoon on Monday,
Okay.
Okay with me.
Okay with you?
or I could do late afternoon on Tuesday too.
Well, let's stick with Monday since you're here anyway. All right.
Well, unless John is here,
Oh,
unless
oh,
everybody's here on
I'm off.
Tuesday.
John's the whole week, okay. All right, Monday, give us a time, what,
Great.
3?
In your office, or?
Yeah, my office, 3. Okay, that'd be good, then we can wrap this up and move on, because, good,
Plan.
thank you very much.
Interrupt again?
No? Okay,
Ed did a great job, and
Yep.
the neighbors
Yep.
were.
Well, I was happy with the slideshow, I didn't hear all the presentation, but if you guys thought it was good, the neighbors they got it, and they understood what we're,
You get it, they asked a lot of questions, which is good.
okay, good.
Okay,
Uh,
thanks.
Chapter 11, roll.
Chapter 11. So we've got 2 Tom comments. One, he'd like the figure 1-1 potentially inserted into this chapter.
I just think, when you've got a big summary chapter like this, it's easy to, instead of, Yeah, it won't take up much space. This is a short chapter anyway, and it just, anyway. And it said the plan, and I didn't know what.
So that's referring to the schedule and the
Hmm?
It's referring to the schedule in the targeted watershed management plan.
Okay.
That plan outlines the steps forward, which we're following, which we can clarify that.
The sentence before says the plan for Little Pond, right?
Yeah, so that's the targeted watershed plan for Little Pond.
Right, but then within this, you talk about the Bournes Pond watershed, right? As outlined in the plan,
To address Bourne's.
it says to address Bournes Pond. That's where I got confused.
Yeah, so you have the Little Pond plan, and then you have to issue a notice of project change for Bourne's Pond. So
But that's part of the Little Pond plan? That's where I guess I'm confused.
Yeah, I see Tom's point. In other words, you say,
It says,
the Massachusetts DEP approved the targeted watershed plan for Little Pond on October, blah, blah,
yeah,
as outlined in the plan. So,
The little
at
pond
that point,
targeted.
you're, by definition, by grammar, you're referring to the Little Pond plan.
right,
But I don't think that's what you mean.
No.
right.
But you mean, what you mean is outlined in this, in the blah, blah, blah plan, however, the town has submitted blah, blah, blah.
So the Little Pond plan, when that was issued, it was known that you would have to do a notice of project change
Right.
for Bourne's Pond. So
Oh,
Oh, so you do mean,
so
you
the
do
Bournes
mean-
Pond thing was part of the little,
it was outlined that we would have to do that.
okay.
I realize it's a very confusing.
Yeah, it is, okay.
But unfortunately, the state, every time you make a change.
Well, why don't you say then, as outlined in that plan, the town,
Yeah, no,
okay, that makes it very specific that you're talking about the Little Pond
Yeah,
plan.
okay.
Okay. Because I thought maybe I had missed some earlier plan or something. So, yeah, just change, yeah.
Wordsmithing. Steve still wants to know if Little Pond's been connected. We already answered that.
Right.
Tom's questioning nitrogen control bylaw for fertilizer, if that's the title. The title is nitrogen control, is what the bylaw is.
It's called
And
the
it
nitrogen
references-
control bylaw.
Hmm?
Okay, so, yeah, I don't know, a bit of a stickler about uppercase, as you've seen all the way
Yes, I
through.
noticed.
If it's a formal title of something, and it's the complete title, then, it should be uppercase. So, maybe just put fertilizer, yeah, lowercase, and everything else is clear. That's the only reason I raised that question there.
Okay.
And I'm glad you knew the answer to that.
I looked it up.
Oh,
I read your comments before I printed them.
all right.
And then you want to change all of the table titles around?
Well, yeah, when it says chapter 4, my first thought is, I don't know what's in chapter 4. I mean, as much time as I've dug through the thing, so I just thought it was,
You didn't read it all again in one fell swoop?
yeah, well, I just thought,
I like it the way you did it.
you like the way I did it? Yeah, because I think you look through, well, where's the thing for Little Pond, or where's the thing for Great Pond?
Right.
And it shows up right away. That's all all that stirring around in there I was doing was
Then you can see why we send these all to Kristen and not back and forth, because otherwise Tom would have commented that my comment is misspelled.
wait a minute,
We're not allowed to. Open a meeting law won't
Yeah.
let us.
No, you can do it now.
So Steve wants to know about IAs in Little Pond.
What about?
Right, what do you
We
want to know
already- we
about
already
them?
It's somewhere, I know, but it's somewhere it said something about,
in that table, it says IA systems.
Right.
oh, yeah, right, you're getting credit for IA systems in Little Pond. How do you do that?
So what the
No,
difference,
There is one.
so what the difference is these tables aren't always things that have been done, they're potential projections to meet it. So that was part of the initial, I guess,
But it-
plan to put in so many IA systems.
Aren't we getting credit for the one at Atria? Which
I
is
don't think one would give you 340
Well,
kilograms per
it's
year.
for all of Atria.
Atria Woodbury.
Is that what that one is?
Yeah, they put in an IA, and it,
So that's,
No,
that's to make up the gap.
that's
Because
for,
what that's showing you is that you can't meet it with sewering, fertilizers, stormwater,
Oh, okay, fine.
That was, yeah, that was saying we only get 88%
Right, what
by
are you gonna do about
sewering.
the 12?
And there
But
was,
you meet it, if you don't have the 340 for IAs, you're still
No,
right at your 5,000.
Yeah,
Well, the
Well,
document was,
couldn't we say potential IA systems? I mean, it just,
Virginia and I had this discussion, and I think that's just getting into the weeds.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah, but
Yeah.
let me tell you, the
Because
bad part
everything
of
is
it
there, potential
is we're
shellfish.
still working on IAs in the management plan and all that stuff, and we don't even know if they work and so on. And then here we're using them in Little Pond. It just
No,
seems
no,
weird.
this is for stuff we aren't doing but might have to do if blah,
Right.
blah, 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 blah.
Because every other chapter table, we have potential for shellfish. There's no shellfish in some of these ponds, but we're taking the number for it, and it's a potential.
Okay.
You wanna, is the word potential in there? You want it?
Well, that's what I
We would
just
have to
said.
put that in
Don
a lot
doesn't
of
like that.
places, though.
I just don't think, I think it's, I brought up the same thing to Virginia.
yeah.
We
Right.
chatted about it over the phone and decided, at this stage, because there's another place where we actually have IAs installed.
Right,
and
but, yeah, go ahead.
It just seems that this,
Well, I think,
well,
I would, if I was in charge of it, I'd say potential or something like that.
well, I think by
Also
calling
for
it
the
an approach
aquaculture.
in each title doesn't indicate that we're actually doing it. This is our
Right.
approach
Your
that we're
targeted
planning on
plan
using.
is where you're going to say, here's the potential, here's what we're doing, when you get to each targeted plan, as opposed to this, which is just the update that has, here are all of the ingredients, we're gonna do what we can.
it's like saying the potential for doing the Bourne Pond Bridge widening. You know, we've put a
You want-
number in for
yeah,
that, but we don't put
done it, yeah.
potential.
Okay.
And so those IA systems, like, it's basically the maximum you can get with IMAs, because it's looking at all the non-sewer properties, how much you can get out, so.
And just for consistency's sake, in some cases in the tables, we've carefully inserted shellfish aquaculture. In other places, we've just been generic. I think if we just call it aquaculture all the time, we're fine, right?
Yeah, is there any other kind besides
Well,
shellfish?
oh, sure, I mean, we could be
shellfish?
growing kelp
Oh.
or,
Or
you know, a
fish.
bunch of other things.
Yeah.
But anyway, oh, okay, someone would have taken that home.
All right, shellfish it is. Okay.
So, minor stuff. Till we get to 11.2.3.
Invisible ink.
It assigns it itself.
She didn't want you to read it.
This was a paragraph that Virginia added in.
You can read it in red if you want to read it.
Yeah, can you see it better up there?
Okay.
No, can anybody read it in the yellow? No? Okay. Maybe you want to read it out,
Can I read it to you in
read
there?
it out loud? Nobody can read it.
The yellow's
Read it in the
painful.
red.
Okay, so the addition is, in the process of developing the TWMP, Falmouth must make an important decision in choosing a site for discharge of the treated effluent. A short-term option that can handle just the flow from the proposed sewer area of the Great Pond watershed, or a long-term option that can accommodate all of the present and future flows expected from the planning area of this CWMP. The financing plan in Table 11.7 is consistent with Falmouth's originally stated policy of funding sewer projects in those years when new debt can replace retiring old debt, thereby not increasing the tax rate. The next funding window is fiscal year 2025. Town meeting and the voters would approve a bond issue of $60 million in April or May 2024 to be effective at the start of fiscal year 2025 on July 1st, 2024.
Does it make sense to put, would have to approve a bond issue of $60 million?
What has she got?
She
It just
says
says would right
approve.
Oh,
now.
yeah, would need to.
Right, well, I'm saying, but that
Yeah.
would emphasize it a little bit more, would have to approve.
Right,
Need
sure.
to or have to?
Need to or have to?
Well, I like have to,
Have
but
to.
Okay. make Tom happy.
I don't like
Sounds a
that.
little more imperative.
I have a problem with that first sentence, and I wasn't paying attention to Virginia trying to put her thumb on the scale here.
I'm
Site
shocked.
14 and 15 no one has ever thought of it as short-term, and we're not that sure about the capacity yet. So I think it's premature to announce that it only takes that much capacity and that it's short-term. I would take that sentence out.
I think what she's referring to there, if you go back to the last page, which is 11.2.2.
Yeah.
So Virginia added B, which is basically saying that instead of looking at discharge incrementally, one of the decision points the town is going to have to be is, at some point in the near future, we're going to need to think about discharge for our entire project and make a decision about how we're going to approach it.
Well, you can leave that if you want, but like I say, this one seems pejorative.
Also, it says the following table 11.7. Where's table 11.7?
Didn't I send that to you separate?
Oh, you probably did.
Steve, it's
I
this
might
one?
not have printed it. Sorry,
I
yeah,
didn't
that
print it.
table.
Okay, okay.
Sorry, I neglected printing it.
So now what's the first sentence say?
It refers to the,
In the process of evaluating, Falmouth must make an important decision in choosing a
Yeah.
site for the discharge of treated effluent.
no, everything following that makes me uncomfortable.
A short-term option that can handle just that flow from the proposed sewered area of Great Pond watershed.
Right.
Or a long-term solution that will accommodate all the present and future flows of the, so,
None of the three sites, even 14 and 15, has been described as a short-term solution at any of our meetings. And the fact is, we don't know what the discharge capacity is there, because there's a couple of variables that are in the process of being looked at. So to say that it is limited to only taking it from the Great Pond, is not accurate at this point.
So even if you got rid of the short-term, long-term phrases, but kept the two different
You can say
options, in other
one
words, just
option
the
that
flow
can
from the
just
proposed,
handle.
Well,
or
we don't
one
know
that can accommodate all the present.
We don't know that at all, that it would only accommodate the flow from.
But it's kind of driving home, if you put it in those terms, it's driving home John's point of the biggest issue in Falmouth is if you look incrementally.
No, I get that,
Right.
but this could.
Well,
come-
then,
this
so
would come
what,
back to
all
bite
right,
us.
suppose you drop out everything that Eric wants to drop out, don't do it yet.
So all of that.
Yeah, but then you say, in the process of developing this TWMP, Falmouth must make
they've
an
already,
important decision in choosing
we've
a
said that,
policy for combination of sites for the treated effluent or something like
but
that.
she said that in section 2 under B.
True, isn't this like a summary of it?
Well, it's adding
Oh, I see,
an
yeah,
opinion
no,
to it.
yes,
that
yes.
it may not be warranted by the facts at the end of the day. So I would hope to see this piece out because it's controversial and it hasn't been determined yet.
Okay with me, drop it out.
Well, so,
She'll learn not to not show up for me.
I know, I'll leave you guys alone for an hour.
yeah, I would think we could get rid of it here as long as it's in
It's in
that
it's
B.
in the other part. Right, okay, we're all for it. Take it out, thank you.
Oh, that's fast.
Okay,
Click.
roll.
That's pretty much it for chapter 11.
We're good. Yep. Any other amendments to be offered up for chapter 11?
Aye.
If not, all
I'll
in favor?
move that we accept.
If not, all in favor of chapter 11 as amended, signify by saying aye.
Yes, aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. Chapter 12. After 5 o'clock, GHD charges us overtime, so let's get moving.
It's all right, there's not really much in chapter 12.
All right.
we just start with some wordsmithing and 12.3.3. John's changing infiltration to discharge.
No, that's someone else's.
No, that's
No,
John.
that was me.
Yeah, that's not me.
I said John.
Oh, I heard Tom, sorry.
No.
Yes, and I agree, it's great, discharge.
On the next page, 12.4.1, Matt made some strikeouts in the first sentence there, and he's got a comment.
Why don't you want to consider the performance of the demonstration project? Oh, Matt's gone.
Matt's not here.
Is he just saying that that last part is important and needs to be stated explicitly? Basically that based on the adaptive management approach, the plan can be modified?
That's what I'm reading it to be. I think he wants it to just be more directly stated that we can modify the plan.
That's the way I would like to.
But if
I
he's the
think
only
that-
member that
that's
feels that
okay.
way and the rest of them are fine,
John's okay with it.
I'm
you're
with it.
okay as is?
Okay with it.
You okay with it as is?
Tom looks like he's okay with it.
Yeah,
It's 'cause it's 4:45. So Matt's got another comment in 12.4.2.
Yeah.
I think that's probably for GHD.
That specific plan itself has not been updated. I can verify that, but
Okay.
that's the way this one.
yeah.
And then Tom has some comments at the bottom of this page. Tom has
Right.
comments, Steve has
Yeah,
a comment.
if you're just quoting Lucy there, I suppose, but really what you're talking about is linking rates or availability or whatever term you want to use to these other factors. But it's not a big deal at all. It's a very minor.
Would you like rates
I like
added?
rates.
Yeah, I like rates too. I think that's,
Rates it is.
rates it is. Good.
And then Steve has a comment right
Mine
below
is just
that.
having fun. It's really
Okay.
nice. It's ironic, given that they subsidize the FEMA rate.
I'm glad you have fun editing these.
You gotta do something.
Yeah, Steve, get a life.
So Tom's doing some wordsmithing, and that's it for chapter 12.
Aye.
Aye.
It's unanimous.
Aye, mates.
Okay, unanimous vote. Reports of members and staff. Tom had one.
Oh, yeah, I,
Method profile and child's visit.
yes, in the last, 2 weeks, I had a couple of field trips. A week ago, Sunday, along with Chris Neal and Linda Deegan and Wendy Busler, we, started the first profiling of the altered watercourse that's now the lower Coonamessett
Wow.
River. If you remember that Sunday, well, you weren't here, you were in the south of France, having a grand time. It was South Texas in Falmouth. They scheduled the field trip for 1 to 3 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. It was just incredibly hot. And of course, 1 p.m. daylight is local noon, right, and standard time. And, but anyway, the old river, these are two sections close together, profiled at right angles to the current flow. The old thing was like a baking sheet with nearly vertical sides and 8 inches deep, 20 centimeters deep, all the way across uniform sandy bottom. That's this side here. And the new profile, here are 2 different profiles across it. We had water depths of 1 meter or slightly greater. and much greater complexity of bottom types, gravel and organic matter and bunches of other things. So that's a pretty dramatic change in the cross-section across the water course. And then a week ago yesterday, the day after the tornadoes, because the trip was scheduled for that day, we went up and walked along the Child River for the similar, much smaller scale project that's being put forth up there to take two small bogs and convert them to a more natural water course. But that's still in the initial stages, nothing like this going on. So that's all I have to say about that, unless people have questions about what's going on there.
That's great.
The Coonamessett thing is really,
That is
really
amazing.
impressive. It
Yeah.
really is. Because there's big undercut banks now and waist-deep water, which we were grateful for, given the air temperature. We
Yes.
were in there.
Have they started plantings to produce shade over the river?
Yes, the big success there is alders. They've really taken off, but they've got other stuff planted, but that's gonna be a very long-term process. But the alders have really started in, but it's a small part right now of it.
Very good. I'd like to report on the south of France. We went to a place for lunch, and it turned out, guess who was there? Chris Rock, Bono, I mean, all these people you've never heard of, but these are important people. Sacha Baron Cohen, the guy who does the movies, Woody Harrelson, they're all there while we're having lunch.
So you knew to go there and hang out with them?
We knew nothing.
You were
of
on the list.
We knew nothing of the sort. We just happened to be there. Yeah, well, that's it.
Well,
My wife took a picture of herself with Matthew McConaughey,
Well.
whatever his name is. And, then Matthew McConaughey says, oh yeah, you can get a picture with the guy behind me too. So she goes up to Woody Harrelson and said, can I take a selfie with you? He said, no, I don't take pictures.
oh, good. Well, I had a
Boycott his movies if you get a chance. But that was the news from South France.
Well, I had old news from close to home. We were in what I always called the rude bar
Okay.
one night for dinner, and we got up and finished up and got up to leave, and I got out to the front door, and someone said, did you know you were sitting next to Julia Roberts? And of course I didn't. She was here. If I'd been across the table, I'd have probably known right away.
Yeah.
But it's similar.
Right.
Like people said, oh yeah, you spent the night, your dinner sitting next to Julia Roberts, and it never registered. I said, well, no, I wasn't rude enough to check out the babe sitting next to me.
Who knew? One more relevant piece of information I just got from the assessor's office. You remember when we did the sewering, the 1,600 units, and everybody said, oh, these poor old people are gonna need a deferment available, so they won't have to pay the betterment. Well, guess how many applied for a deferment?
All right. Good.
Nobody?
Well,
Nobody.
Amy said that there are 10 systems. You're talking about Little Pond?
Yeah.
There are 10 systems that still haven't connected. And she's working with them, and there's only one where there's, I think her words were, a legitimate
Hardship.
financial hardship.
Yeah.
There's been no problems here.
Hold on.
Minutes of the prior meeting.
Hey, would you like my actual work-related report?
Excuse me?
Would you like my work-related report, not on the south of France, about East Falmouth Village Association
Oh,
in
yes.
Davisville?
Oh, yeah, you have
Oh, yes.
two reports, by the way.
Yes, I was working while you were on vacation. Last week, I spoke to East Falmouth Village Association about what's going on with Mill Pond. I told them what we're looking at as far as opening those conversations with DEP about the tailwater recovery system, and also told them that we are in the process of filing the NOI to do the harvesting in Mill Pond, of which the NOI is pretty much written. I've met with Concom. It qualifies as an ecological restoration limited project, with Jennifer McKay has not had come through there before. So her and the filing requirement is a little bit different, so we're muddling through that. But overall, East Falmouth was very receptive, very happy to hear that we are making efforts, happy to hear our plans. So that was Thursday night. Saturday, I went and I talked to Davisville, mostly about the inlet widening. There were a bunch of people who had been at the East Falmouth meeting there. They were all very receptive to that as well. DPW spoke at East Falmouth, so they gave an update on road permitting, and how they want to combine both projects into one and use one contractor for it. They said they anticipate permits maybe within 18 to 24 months. So, that was what they reported.
Well, that's the growing project, the other project.
Right. The big concerns I got from East Falmouth was concerns raised about the current height, water level height in Mill Pond and who controls the boards. So that was a concern from them. Lawrence Pond, some of the questions that were raised were, if we open the inlet, will the water level rise? Is there dredging included in the plan? So things like that. But overall, everything was very well received, and people seem to be on board and happy that things are happening. So,
I will remind the committee back in 1983, when we applied for the first inlet opening at Bourne's Pond, some nitwit at DEP asked us to prove that if we opened this inlet at this location, that the water in the pond would not all run out.
That's in the same category as the one Chuck Martinson reported, the questions. When he dredges under a bridge, will it be easier to get your boat under the bridge?
Well, if you have a deep draft vessel.
No, he meant the air draft.
Well, I know, but if you,
If it's the Bourne Pond Bridge, it won't make, you get a 4-foot height here.
My powerboat used to have the top spindle on the steering wheel taken out.
yep.
So that I could get under the Woods Hole Bridge without.
I've done it. I've taken my steering wheel out to get under the, yeah, because that becomes the high point in
Take
the,
the steering wheel off,
I
Yeah.
just took the top spindle
how
off.
do you steer?
you're not trying to steer, you're under the bridge, you just grab the bridge and pull the boat under.
Okay, don't try this at home.
But when I did my boat, it's center console, but the windshield and the frame and all fold down.
Uh-huh.
So then the steering wheel becomes the high point on the boat.
Well,
Yeah.
I have a separate note that I am supposed to ask as we're starting discussions for printing this monster CWMP,
oh yeah,
what your preference is as far as having the appendices. So the appendice volume is about 3.5 inches thick, whether you guys would like your own
No.
printed copy or whether
No,
you would like it
no,
electronically.
No.
no,
I think everybody gets their own preference.
I think nobody wants the appendices.
No,
Okay.
Virginia might, I can't imagine anybody else.
no. As long as they're available somewhere in the cloud.
Yes, oh, they're in the cloud.
And the other question with that, and this could be a continued conversation, but for the ones that we do have to make hard copies, if we want some in black and white, or if everything needs to be in color.
Oh, that's a
The-
Virginia decide.
Yeah.
This was more ask the members what they wanted.
Yeah, I
Was
think we'd
the
be
note I
interested in
was told
color,
to
but not
ask.
yellow.
All right.
All right,
Are we all
minutes,
set?
everybody
I think the
seen
minutes are great.
minutes are great, moved and seconded,
That's
the
like
minutes are great,
4
all in
times in a
favor,
row.
signify by
I know,
saying
I'm trying to be-
Aye, opposed, the minutes have been adopted.
Nope.
Motion to adjourn?
Before we adjourn, let's discuss the meeting schedule for the next
Okay.
6 weeks or so.
Well,
Just-
August,
Just so we're on,
okay, August 15th, 14th, when is it?
no,
Wednesday, August 15th, Thursday is definitely on.
What time?
That's a good question.
And I'll be
You-
off.
You're not gonna be around.
the 15th you don't know time yet. Okay.
No,
What's the subject on that
that's a
one?
fair question, right?
The executive summary is on there.
Right, it'll be the tail end of all
Yeah,
all these
The
sections.
wrap-up, yep.
Executive summary and introduction,
No, that's still part of the executive summary.
okay,
Yeah,
introduction.
what you're writing is
And
that
is
last
it-
part of the executive summary.
Okay, anything else except the
Is this
executive
a-
summary?
That's all I'm aware of.
Is the meeting on the
Oh,
15th at SEA?
We canceled SEA, have we canceled that by now?
I didn't know there was an SEA.
Did we ever?
I wrote down that we were meeting at SEA on the 15th.
No,
That
the
was-
last time we were at Eric's, we decided that there
Right.
was no, we basically
At your
talked-
recommendation, by the way, that we not have that community meeting this year, because we just had it last year.
Oh, that's right, that was that.
All right.
Right.
Okay, so, good point, did we make some reservation with them for the room?
I didn't, did
Don't
you?
look at me.
No,
Okay, then we
Okay.
didn't.
So if we haven't, we don't have to cancel it.
Okay.
Yes,
And tentatively now, we're having a joint meeting with the selectmen, venue to be determined.
yeah, it would be here at their regular meeting
Oh,
on September
like the 18th or something?
16th.
16th.
That's what we've requested, that's what the chairman of the selectmen said we could have. I haven't, and that's what I wrote to the town manager and said, we're very happy to come that day.
So that's.
We haven't heard back and said, you are locked in for that day, but that's our plan.
Right, but do you think that venue,
That would be 7 at night, or
it'd be part of the regular
regular.
selectmen
We
meeting
would
here?
we would have 2 hours to roll out everything we've done for the last 10 years at that meeting. It'll be a slide presentation with
Yeah,
maybe an hour for the presentation and an hour for
give and take.
interaction with the committee and the selectmen.
I bring forth the painting, the symbolism of the painting here.
Are they shooting us?
We're the good guys over here in the blue, and
Okay.
everybody else is in the
Okay.
red over there.
What
Right?
about
Don't you
August
think?
15th? Are we doing something in or not?
You ready to come home?
Schedule it. We'll figure how much needs to be done. With the ending of this,
I'm just getting out of this meeting. so I
these
can do that.
chapters, the summary, executive
okay.
summary and the introduction will be
Doesn't
there.
make it- I can come down there if you'd like.
I'll see what else, if it's not worth anything else, we'll figure out
Okay.
something else, but that's
Sounds
the
We
good.
have
current
another
plan.
meeting,
Fine.
we have a meeting scheduled before then, just of us then, in early September?
Yes, if they're doing the 16th, we should probably do
The 5th?
the 5th or the 12th.
Well, I won't be here for the
Fifth.
12th, as I mentioned
Okay.
to you the other day, so the
Better be the 5th.
5th,
The
if you
5th
want.
would be the regular meeting.
All right, so let's stick with the 5th.
Okay.
Because, yeah, if we did something on the 12th, we wouldn't have time to do
Right.
much about it before the 16th.
Are you still on morning schedule for that, or are you on standard time for September?
Do we want to go back to 3:30?
I think 3:30 is fine.
Okay.
What do
Okay.
you want for the 15th of August?
Why don't we get back, see what we got, see what we got for an
Right now, it's a
agenda.
short agenda. I would say put it at 3:30. and
Yeah,
if
okay, yeah,
decide-
3:30 unless we hear different.
Okay.
And then we'd skip the 29th.
When do things have to be in for town meeting?
That's a good question. First week of September.
So, Tom, I had chatted with Chuck Martinson a
Right.
while ago, and I was trying to find him this week and didn't. He was thinking about a bylaw change that would make it so that reef in West Falmouth Harbor could never be harvested.
Yes.
And he thought that required some sort of a town meeting.
I haven't heard.
Anyway, I
What-
was just wondering if next time you see him, you might mention.
Okay, because what we have discussed is that you could only harvest single
That was it.
oysters,
Right.
which would have the same effect and would be more broadly applicable to whatever other sites we have in
I
town.
don't.
I think that's right. That's what
That's-
he's talking
okay.
about.
Okay.
Is that in the works now?
Well, we've discussed that, but I don't think we need a town bylaw to set that, because the Shellfish Constable has, I mean, I'm not town council.
Can I ask for a motion to adjourn and then continue
Yes,
this conversation?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Moved and seconded, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Yeah.
Guys have it. Goodbye.
All right, thanks, Eric.